The Fairmount Community Theater stood as a modest fixture along Main Street in the small Indiana town where James Dean had spent most of his youth. Unlike the grand movie palaces of Indianapolis or the glittering theaters of New York where he'd briefly studied, this venue retained the worn charm of rural America. Wooden floors that announced every late arrival with an unavoidable creak, walls adorned with faded promotional posters from productions past, and seats that had supported the weight of generations of local theater-goers. On this particular Friday evening in late September 1953, the air hung heavy with the mingled scents of buttered popcorn, perfume, and the musty velvet curtains. The temperature inside had steadily climbed throughout the evening as nearly 200 bodies filled the limited space. Outside, autumn was making its first serious advances across the Midwest, painting the surrounding farmlands in muted golds and ambers, but inside the theater, condensation formed on the windows as the audience settled in for the second act. James Dean, barely 22 years old and still unknown beyond the circles of theater students and a handful of television casting directors, stood in the wings. His lean frame was draped in the simple costume of his character, a working-class young man caught in familial conflict, not unlike the roles that would later define him. He ran his fingers through his hair, a gesture that would become iconic in publicity photographs just years later, though tonight it was merely the nervous habit of a performer preparing to enter the stage. 5 minutes, Jimmy, whispered the stage manager, an older woman who had known Dean since his high school performances. Dean nodded, his eyes already focused somewhere beyond the physical space, retreating into the emotional landscape of his character. Those who worked with him, even in these early days, noted this quality, an ability to disappear so completely into a role that the boundary between performance and reality seemed to blur. He wasn't yet the cultural icon who would embody American youth rebellion, just a serious young actor with ambitions that seemed outsized for someone from Fairmount, Indiana. The local newspaper had advertised the production with modest enthusiasm. Former Fairmount High graduate James Dean returns in Harvest Tension, a new drama by regional playwright Thomas Sherwood. Most in attendance were there to support local talent, or because Friday night entertainment options were limited in a town of under 3,000 people. Few suspected they were watching someone who would, within 18 months, become one of Hollywood's most magnetic new stars. When Dean stepped onto the stage, the subtle shift in the audience's attention was palpable. Even in this unremarkable production, in this unremarkable venue, something about his presence commanded notice. The first act had established his character as the troubled son of a hardscrabble farmer, and now came the confrontation scene, the emotional centerpiece where generational tensions erupted into open conflict. Dean's performance technique, influenced by his studies with Lee Strasberg and the emerging method approach, brought an uncomfortable authenticity to the stage. While other actors in the production delivered their lines with the slightly exaggerated projection typical of community theater, Dean seemed to be experiencing his character's frustration in real time. His voice would drop to almost a whisper, forcing the audience to lean forward, then explode in sudden emotional outbursts that made the front row visibly flinch. "I've given everything to this land," shouted his scene partner, a 50-something local insurance salesman playing the father. "And you? You want to throw it all away for some pipe dream in the city?" Dean turned away, his shoulders hunched in the posture of contained defiance that would later become his signature. The theater lights caught the sharp angles of his face as he delivered his response, his voice carrying a tremor of genuine emotion. "You never understood. This place, it's your prison, not mine. I need more than dirt under my fingernails and regret in my heart." The line, melodramatic on paper, carried surprising weight in Dean's delivery. Throughout the audience, people shifted uncomfortably, perhaps recognizing the universal tension between roots and ambition, between loyalty to origins and the pull toward something greater. For many in attendance, the farm crisis of the early 1950s had made such family conflicts all too real, as agricultural consolidation forced difficult choices on many Midwestern families. It was during the escalating tension of this scene, as Dean moved center stage for his character's emotional declaration of independence, that a voice cut through from the back of the theater. "You'll never make it." The words, sharp and mocking, came from somewhere in the last few rows, a teenager's voice breaking with the strain of forced bravado. A ripple of nervous laughter followed, the kind that spreads when an unexpected disruption breaks the carefully maintained illusion of theater. The other actors on stage froze momentarily, their concentration broken. The woman playing Dean's mother glanced off stage, clearly seeking direction from the unseen director. The teenage girl playing his sister visibly tensed, uncertain how to proceed. But it was Dean's reaction that crystallized the moment. Mid-sentence, he stopped. The script called for him to continue his impassioned monologue about escaping small-town limitations, but instead, a profound stillness descended over his thin frame. His expression, visible even to those seated in the back rows, transformed from the character's frustration to something more immediate and personal. The silence that followed lasted only seconds but felt significantly longer to everyone present. The wooden seats creaked as people shifted uncomfortably. Someone coughed. The stage lights hummed, and James Dean, still technically in character but somehow also entirely himself, stood motionless at the center of it all. The heckler had unwittingly created a moment of genuine theater, unscripted, unpredictable, and charged with authentic tension. No one, not even Dean himself, could have anticipated what would happen next, or how this seemingly minor incident in an obscure community theater production would later be recounted as one of the formative moments in the mythology of an American cultural icon. For Dean, the words struck at his deepest insecurities and highest ambitions. Just months earlier, he had returned from New York with dreams partially deferred, taking this local theater role while planning his move to Los Angeles. The Hollywood that would eventually embrace him still seemed impossibly distant from the creaking floorboards of the Fairmount Community Theater. The mocking certainty of the heckler's prediction, "You'll never make it," captured all the doubts that followed him from the farms of Indiana to the competitive studios of New York, and now back again. As the silence stretched and the audience collectively held its breath, no one could have predicted that within 2 years, the name James Dean would be synonymous with American cinema at its most emotionally raw, or that the answer he was about to give would become part of the enduring legend of a life cut tragically short at the height of its promise. The silence that enveloped the Fairmount Community Theater seemed to stretch into infinity. Every eye in the audience fixed on James Dean, standing motionless under the harsh glow of the stage lights. The script lay forgotten in this unscripted moment of genuine human drama. The teenage heckler's words, "You'll never make it," hung in the air like a challenge that demanded response. Dean's face underwent a remarkable transformation. Those sitting close enough could see the initial flash of hurt in his eyes quickly replaced by something deeper, a quiet determination that hardened his features. For those who would later watch him on the silver screen, this was the same intensity that would captivate millions. But on this night, it was witnessed by fewer than 200 people in a small Indiana town. What happened next would be recounted differently by various witnesses over the years, embellished and polished into the perfect origin story for a future icon. But most accounts agreed on the essentials. Rather than ignoring the interruption or breaking character in anger, Dean did something unexpected. He stepped away from his fellow actors and moved deliberately toward the edge of the stage. The wooden planks creaked under his slow, measured steps. The spotlight operator, momentarily confused, adjusted to follow him as he approached the apron of the stage. Dean's movements had a deliberate quality that transformed the interruption from an embarrassment into something approaching ritual. From the wings, the director made an aborted gesture, clearly wanting to intervene but hesitating as Dean's purpose became apparent. This was no longer about the play they had rehearsed. Something more authentic was unfolding. Dean reached the edge of the stage and stood there, his slight frame somehow commanding the entire space. The harsh lighting cast dramatic shadows across his face, accentuating the sharp cheekbones and penetrating eyes that would soon become famous on magazine covers across America. His gaze slowly scanned the back rows, searching for the source of the mockery. The audience's discomfort was palpable. Some shifted in their seats, others exchanged uneasy glances. The teenager who had shouted the taunt was suddenly the focus of peripheral attention as people tried to identify him without obviously turning around. He was 16, maybe 17, a local high school student with a Letterman jacket and the casual cruelty of adolescent insecurity. Under Dean's unwavering gaze, the young man's bravado visibly faltered. He slouched lower in his seat, perhaps regretting his impulsive outburst now that it had created this unexpected confrontation. When Dean finally spoke, his voice was not raised in anger, but controlled and deliberate. The theater's acoustics carried his words clearly to every corner of the room. "Maybe not," he said, the simplicity of the response adding to its power. His Midwestern accent, which he would later work to neutralize in his Hollywood roles, was still present in these two words, a reminder of his roots even as he addressed the doubt about his future. "But I'll spend my life proving you wrong." The delivery was perfect, not rehearsed, but somehow inevitable. There was no melodrama in it, none of the overacting that sometimes characterized community theater productions. Instead, there was something that the audience recognized as authentic emotion, raw, unfiltered, and powerful in its restraint. The silence that followed lasted only moments, but in that brief span, something shifted in the atmosphere of the theater. The mockery had been transformed into something else entirely, a public declaration of purpose from a young man standing at the threshold of his future. Then, spontaneously, someone in the middle rows began to applaud. The sound was quickly joined by others until the small theater filled with the thunder of appreciation. It wasn't just approval for how Dean had handled the interruption, it was recognition of something more profound, the universal human struggle against doubt, captured in 6 simple words. The teenager who had shouted the taunt shrank further into his seat, his moment of attention-seeking now overshadowed by Dean's composed response. Whatever satisfaction he had sought in disrupting the performance had backfired completely, transforming a routine community theater production into a moment of unexpected authenticity. Dean held his position for a moment longer, maintaining eye contact with his heckler, neither triumphant nor angry, simply present and unwavering. Then, with the same deliberate movement, he turned and walked back to his original position on stage. The other actors, frozen throughout this exchange, seemed to collectively exhale. Without further acknowledgement of the interruption, Dean nodded almost imperceptibly to his fellow performer, picking up the scene exactly where it had been interrupted. But something had changed. His performance, already compelling before the interruption, now carried an additional charge of emotion. The words from the script, about a young man's determination to escape the limitations of his environment and pursue his dreams against all odds, now resonated with the unmistakable current of personal truth. The boundary between James Dean the actor and the character he portrayed had temporarily dissolved, allowing the audience a glimpse of the raw determination that would propel him from this modest stage to international fame. The remainder of the performance unfolded without further incident, but the energy in the theater had been permanently altered. Even those who had attended out of mere obligation or habit found themselves genuinely engaged, sensing they were witnessing something beyond ordinary community theater. As the final scene concluded and the cast assembled for their bows, the applause was noticeably more enthusiastic than it had been for the previous night's performance. Dean's acknowledgement was characteristically understated, a slight nod, a half-smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Already, it seemed, his mind was elsewhere, looking beyond this small-town stage to the broader horizons he was determined to reach. Few in attendance that night could have predicted just how far that determination would take him, or how little time he would ultimately have to fulfill the promise made in that moment of spontaneous defiance. But something significant had occurred in the Fairmount Community Theater, a crystallization of purpose that would help propel a farm boy from Indiana toward a destiny that would make his name synonymous with American youth culture for generations to come. The transformation that occurred on stage that September evening in Fairmount didn't end when the curtain fell. As the audience filed out of the community theater, conversations buzzed with discussion of the unexpected exchange, the heckle and the response that had elevated a routine local production into something memorable. James Dean, still in costume, accepted the congratulations of fellow cast members with a distracted half-smile. The director, a former high school drama teacher who had first recognized Dean's raw talent years earlier, placed a weathered hand on his shoulder. "You handled that perfectly, Jimmy," she said, her voice carrying the distinctive Hoosier accent that Dean himself was working to shed. "Though I hope you know not everyone in this town feels that way." Most are proud of what you're trying to accomplish." Dean nodded, but his mind seemed elsewhere. The confrontation had crystallized something for him, a public declaration that demanded follow-through. Standing on that stage, looking into the eyes of doubt personified, he'd made a promise not just to his heckler, but to himself. The words hung in the air of the small dressing room like an oath. "I'll spend my life proving you wrong." Later that evening, at Metzger's diner, where the cast gathered after striking the set, the incident continued to dominate conversation. Dean sat slightly apart from the group, picking at a slice of apple pie and occasionally joining the discussion with brief comments. The teenage waitress who refilled his coffee cup twice hovered slightly longer than necessary, perhaps sensing that she was in the presence of someone on the verge of becoming more than Fairmount, Indiana would be able to contain. "Are you really going to Hollywood next month?" asked the actress who had played his mother, her voice carrying equal parts admiration and concern. Dean looked up, his fork suspended halfway to his mouth. "Not much left for me here," he replied, his characteristic economy with words already evident. "Got some television possibilities lined up." "Well, after tonight, I'd say you've got the right stuff," offered another cast member. "The way you handled that kid, that wasn't acting. That was something else." Dean shrugged, uncomfortable with the direct praise. "Just said what came to mind." But those who knew him well recognized that the incident had affected him more deeply than his casual response suggested. His high school friend Marcus, who had helped with the stage lighting, observed Dean later that night as they sat on the hood of Dean's old Ford, sharing cigarettes and staring up at the vast Indiana sky. "You're really going through with it then? California?" Dean exhaled a plume of smoke that drifted upward to mingle with the stars. "Got to. After tonight, especially. Because of that idiot in the back row?" Marcus laughed. "Don't tell me you're letting some loudmouth kid push you into this." Dean turned to look at his friend, his expression suddenly intense in the moonlight. "Not pushing me into anything. Just made it clearer. Everything I've been trying to say about this place, about needing to get out, it all came down to that moment." He paused, searching for words. "It's like he was the voice of every person who ever said I was reaching too high, and I needed to answer." Marcus nodded slowly, recognizing the weight of the moment. "Well, when you're accepting your Oscar, remember us little people." Dean smiled then, a rare, full smile that transformed his usually serious face. "If I make it that far, I'll send you a ticket to the ceremony." The next morning, Dean was at the Greyhound station before dawn, a cardboard suitcase containing his few possessions at his feet. He had already said his goodbyes to his aunt and uncle, who had raised him since his mother's death when he was 9. Their parting had been typically understated, Midwesterners unaccustomed to dramatic displays of emotion, even as their nephew prepared to pursue a career built on precisely such displays. The station was empty except for the ticket agent and an elderly woman waiting for the Indianapolis bus. Neither recognized the slender young man in the worn leather jacket as someone whose face would soon be emblazoned on movie screens across America. As the first rays of sunrise painted the eastern sky, Dean purchased his ticket, not directly to Los Angeles, which his limited funds wouldn't allow, but to the next stepping stone in his journey west. His movements were charged with a new sense of purpose, as if the previous night's public declaration had solidified something essential within him. The coming weeks would see him arrive in Los Angeles with little more than determination and talent. His first months there would include small television roles, screen tests, and the persistent hustle of an unknown actor trying to get noticed. But those who worked with him during this period would later remark on his unusual intensity, a sense of absolute certainty about his trajectory that seemed almost prescient. When the call came from director Elia Kazan in early 1954, offering Dean the role of Cal Trask in East of Eden, it represented the pivotal opportunity he had been working toward. On set, his unconventional methods sometimes frustrated more experienced actors, but Kazan recognized something special in Dean's raw, emotional accessibility. During one particularly difficult scene, after multiple takes had failed to achieve what Kazan wanted, the director took Dean aside. "What's driving you, James?" he asked, searching for the emotional key that would unlock the performance he needed. Dean was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. Then, with uncharacteristic openness, he shared the story of the heckler in Fairmount and the promise he'd made in response. Kazan, a master at channeling actors' personal experiences into their performances, nodded with understanding. "Then use it," he said simply. "Use that moment. Put that kid in the back row of your mind and show him what you've become." The next take was electric, filled with the defiant energy that would become Dean's trademark. That scene, like many others in East of Eden, would showcase his unique ability to convey complex emotions with minimal dialogue, relying instead on physical intensity and deeply felt internal truth. When East of Eden premiered in March 1955, critics and audiences were stunned by the emergence of this new talent. The New York Times called his performance a revelation, while Time magazine described him as an exciting new presence on screen. Almost overnight, James Dean became more than an actor. He became a symbol of youthful rebellion and authentic emotion in an era often characterized by conformity. For Dean himself, now fielding offers for major roles and seeing his face on magazine covers, the meteoric rise felt like the fulfillment of the promise made in that small Indiana theater. The teenage heckler's mocking prediction, "You'll never make it," had been definitively answered. As he began work on Rebel Without a Cause, the film that would cement his iconic status, Dean carried with him the transformative energy of that moment in Fairmount, a public vow that had become private fuel for his relentless drive toward cinematic immortality. By the autumn of 1955, James Dean was no longer the unknown actor from a small Indiana town. He had become a cultural phenomenon. His face appeared on magazine covers across America. His distinctive style was being imitated by teenagers from New York to Los Angeles, and his name had become shorthand for a new kind of American youth, rebellious, emotionally raw, and unapologetically authentic. East of Eden had established him as a serious actor with unprecedented screen presence. Rebel Without a Cause, released in October 1955, transformed him into something more, a symbol of adolescent alienation that resonated deeply with post-war America's younger generation. The red jacket, the slouched posture, the brooding intensity, elements that would be endlessly referenced and imitated in American popular culture, all emerged from Dean's second major film. On September 30th, 1955, everything changed. Dean's fatal car crash on a California highway at the age of 24 instantly converted a rising star into an eternal icon. The tragedy occurred just as Rebel Without a Cause was about to be released, and before audiences had seen his final completed film, Giant. In death, as in his brief life, Dean's timing was cinematically perfect, leaving behind just enough work to establish his extraordinary talent, but departing before any potential decline could tarnish his legacy. The news reached Fairmount, Indiana, like a physical blow. The town that had witnessed his early performances, including that pivotal night at the community theater, now found itself cast as the birthplace of a legend. The local newspaper that had once given modest coverage to Dean's high school plays now ran front-page stories about their hometown boy whose star had burned so briefly and brightly. At Metzger's Diner, where Dean had sat with fellow cast members after the heckler incident, the owner placed a framed photograph on the wall, Dean in costume from Rebel Without a Cause, his expression capturing the defiant vulnerability that had become his trademark. A small brass plaque beneath it read simply, "James Dean, Fairmount's own, 1931-1955. For one particular Fairmount resident, the news carried an additional weight of significance. The teenager who had shouted those fateful words, "You'll never make it," now found himself permanently connected to the legend of James Dean. What had been an impulsive act of adolescent cruelty had unwittingly become part of American cultural mythology. His name was Todd Wilkins, a fact that would emerge years later in documentaries about Dean's early life. In 1955, Wilkins was a senior at Fairmount High School, still living in the same town where he'd heckled a future icon. When news of Dean's death reached him, witnesses would later recall that he turned pale and left school early that day, walking home alone through streets already displaying hastily assembled tributes to the town's most famous son. What exactly passed through Wilkins' mind during that walk home has never been recorded, but it isn't difficult to imagine the complex emotions of a young man suddenly confronted with the permanent silencing of someone whose life had, however briefly, intersected with his own in a moment of charged significance. As the 1950s progressed, James Dean's cultural impact only grew. His three major films, East of Eden, Rebel Without a Cause, and Giant, continued to draw audiences, with each viewing reinforcing his status as the actor who had captured something essential about American youth. The circumstances of his death, young, beautiful, at the wheel of a high-performance Porsche Spyder, added the final element to the perfect American tragedy. In 1956, Warner Brothers released Giant, Dean's final film. His performance as Jet Rink, an outsider who rises from poverty to oil wealth, earned him a second posthumous Academy Award nomination. The film's epic sweep provided a different showcase for Dean's talents, allowing him to portray a character aging from youth to middle age with remarkable conviction. During the film's premiere, attendees reported an almost religious silence when Dean first appeared on screen. His presence, knowing he was already gone, created an eerie doubling effect, the living image of a dead man, forever young on celluloid while his physical body lay in a Fairmount cemetery. By the end of the decade, the impact of Dean's brief career had rippled through American culture in ways that transcended cinema. His influence could be seen in the early performances of young actors like Paul Newman and Marlon Brando, in the music of early rock and roll artists, and in the changing fashion sensibilities of American teenagers. More significantly, his performances had helped validate a new emotional language for American masculinity, one that allowed for vulnerability alongside strength, sensitivity alongside rebellion. In the conformist culture of 1950s America, this represented a seismic shift whose effects would continue to reverberate through subsequent decades. In Fairmount, Dean's legacy transformed the small agricultural community. The modest house where he had spent his adolescence became an unofficial pilgrimage site for fans. Local businesses gradually incorporated references to their hometown hero in their signage and decor. The community theater, where that pivotal confrontation had occurred, installed a permanent plaque commemorating Dean's performances on its stage. For Todd Wilkins, the aftermath proved complicated. As Dean's legend grew and the story of the heckler incident became part of the established mythology, Wilkins found himself cast in the role of antagonist in a narrative larger than himself. Local residents who remembered that night occasionally gave him sidelong glances, though few ever directly mentioned the incident to his face. In 1962, 7 years after Dean's death, a film magazine tracked down Wilkins for an article titled "The Man Who Challenged James Dean." By then, 35 years old and working at his family's hardware store, Wilkins was initially reluctant to discuss the incident. When finally persuaded to comment, his response revealed the complex legacy of that moment. "It was just something stupid a kid says, you know. I didn't even really mean it. But the way he looked at me that night, the way he spoke, it's like he knew exactly who he was going to become. And maybe I helped him see that more clearly, though that sure wasn't my intention." Whether Wilkins' assessment was accurate or merely a retrospective attempt to find meaning in his unwitting role in cultural history remains impossible to determine. What is clear is that Dean's response that night, "Maybe not, but I'll spend my life proving you wrong," had indeed proven prophetic, though in a more limited time frame than anyone could have anticipated. As the 1950s gave way to the 1960s, Dean's influence continued to echo through American culture. New generations discovered his films and responded to the emotional authenticity that had made him a star. His image, eternally young, eternally rebellious, became a shorthand for a particular kind of American cool that transcended the decade of his brief career. In this way, the exchange in a small Indiana theater achieved a kind of immortality neither participant could have imagined. The heckler's challenge and Dean's response had become more than an anecdote. They had become a parable about determination and destiny, about the power of doubt to fuel ambition, and about the unpredictable ways in which brief human interactions can resonate through time. For countless young dreamers in small towns across America, Dean's story, including that pivotal moment of public defiance, offered a powerful template for their own ambitions. His words, spoken in that moment of spontaneous truth, continued to echo. "I'll spend my life proving you wrong." In his tragically abbreviated life, James Dean had done exactly that.